Hello class, and welcome to lecture 18 of Philosophy 205. In this lecture, we continue our discussion of the mind by looking at mind-brain identity theory. You can probably tell from the name what the main claim of mind-brain identity theory is, but there are some very interesting and important details that come out by looking at the theory closely. So let's get into it. The question we're asking today is, can mental terms be translated into purely physical terms? You might be wondering why I phrased it this way rather than just asking, is the mental physical? And you'll see next time why I phrased it this way. But there is a reason, and we'll get to that. But first, let's think about a background theory. And that theory is materialism, also known as physicalism. Sober mentions both names for the theory in the book. The theory is this. Every object that exists is physical. So materialism would deny the existence of the soul, the existence of spirits, the existence of angels, the existence of immaterial gods. According to materialism, all that exists is physical things with physical properties. And a corollary of this is that there is no difference without a physical difference. So this means if we're thinking about different things, so if I'm thinking about Copenhagen and you're thinking about basketball, that's a difference between us. So according to materialism, that difference has to be physical. You have to be able to explain that difference in physical terms. Now, materialism is a theory that has motivated a lot of people to look for explanations of the mind that are like mind-brain identity theory. And the reason is they're motivated to avoid what they see as spooky mental terms. You can think of the issue like this. A lot of people, including philosophers, look at the sciences and look at the kind of success that we've had in the sciences. And at this point in time, the physical world is well understood and easy to measure. Obviously, there are things we don't know about the physical world, but we've made a large amount of success in understanding the physical world in ways that 200 years ago, people never would have thought possible. And in particular, we're very good at setting up experiments, setting up measurements, setting up observations of the physical world. Whereas on the other hand, if you think about things purely mental, the purely mental realm is much less understood and much harder to measure. So if someone talks about what they're thinking about, like I'm thinking about my future or I'm feeling sad today, those terms seem much more vague. They're much harder to measure. If you want to measure how much pain someone is in, it seems like the best way is to ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, how much pain are you in? But that obviously is not very precise. So a lot of people looking at this situation have the hope that we can take all these mental terms and be able to translate them into physical terms. So that we take something that's kind of vague, kind of difficult to measure, and translate it into something extremely precise that we can measure extremely precisely. And for this reason, people are attracted to materialism because it seems like there's a lot more success dealing with the physical world, whereas it's just vague and spooky if you get away from anything physical. All right, so this is a background motivation, a reason people are motivated to want to find a theory according to which the mind is just the brain. Because then we just need to look at the brain. We just need to measure the physical states of the brain. And then we won't have to worry about what does it mean to be in love. We'll have a theory of the physics of the brain that covers it. But this is not yet mind-brain identity theory. Before we can explain mind-brain identity theory, we have to draw a distinction between tokens and types. So to do that, take a look at the screen. How many letters are in the red bubble that I've just drawn? There are two answers that you could give to this question. You could say that there's just one letter. There's just the letter B. But another answer you could give is that there are two letters. There's one letter over here, and another letter over here. And both of those answers seem correct. And the reason is there is one type of letter, the type B, but there are two different tokens of the letter. So there's a B written over here and one written over here. So there's just one type. We can say that there's a type B, and that's the only type of letter that's there. But we could also say there are two tokens. There's something written over here and then a different thing written over here. Even though it's the same type, it's a different instance of writing. And so this introduces the concept of token versus type. So we can define a type as a repeatable form. So the form of the letter B is repeatable. Many different things can have the same form. A bunch of different letters spread out across books and billboards can all have the form B. Whereas a token is one instance of a repeatable form. So each time you write another B, that's a new token. Even though it has the same form as all the other B's, it's got the same type, it's a different token. So this is the type-token distinction. Now, how is this relevant to discussions of the mind? It actually plays a key role in the definition of mind-brain identity theory. The statement of the theory is, mental state types are identical to physical state types. And it really does make a difference whether we're talking about types or tokens here. So what we mean by mental state types are, again, repeatable mental forms that can occur in many different places. For example, the belief that snow is white. So I can have that belief, I can believe that snow is white, but you can believe that snow is white. And John Waters can believe that snow is white. So each of us can have a belief of the same form, but each of us has a different token of that same type of belief. But mind-brain identity theory is saying that every mental state type is identical to a physical state type. So the mental state type, believing that snow is white, according to mind-brain identity theory, is identical to some physical state type. So it might turn out that once we figure out the neuroscience perfectly, we'll know that having neurons arranged in this pattern, and this one is activated, and this one is activated, but the one in the middle is not, maybe that's what it means to believe that snow is white. That they're identical. Believing that snow is white and having this particular brain state are exactly the same thing. And it might help to think about the linguistic side of this. So a linguistic corollary of mind-brain identity theory is, at least in theory, you could replace all mental terms in every sentence with equivalent physical terms. So for example, you could refer to me as Ben or Professor Rancourt. So you could use either one to refer to me. And they both refer to the same person. They both refer to me. So any sentence where you talk about Ben, when you're referring to me, you could replace it and the sentence would still be true. According to mind-brain identity theory, the same thing happens with mental state types and physical state types. Anytime there's a sentence that talks about believing that snow is white, according to this theory, there's a description of a physical state that you could put in there and it would be just as good. The sentence would still be true and it would mean exactly the same thing. So instead of saying, John believes that snow is white, you could say, John is in brain state whatever, whatever, whatever with this, this, this. And they would mean exactly the same thing. So one example, this is kind of out of date. For a little while, people thought that this was true, but now there's evidence that it isn't. But let's just go back in time to a simpler day when this seemed like it could be true. At one point, there was evidence suggesting that pain, the state of pain in humans, was identical to C fibers firing. There's a particular kind of nerve fiber that's called C fibers, and for a while it looked like anytime someone was in pain, C fibers were firing, and whenever C fibers were firing, people were in pain. So it looked like maybe these were exactly the same thing. So according to mind-brain identity theory, we could say pain is identical to C fibers firing. They're exactly the same thing. So then anytime someone says, I'm in pain, you could replace that with, my C fibers are firing. So that's what the theory says. You can completely replace any reference to pain with references to C fibers firing. That's mind-brain identity theory. And so according to mind-brain identity theory, this will be true not just for pain, but for other emotions like fear, happiness, and more complicated states that include emotions like love. And it'll also be true for mental states like thinking about tomorrow, wishing you had a faster car, wanting to go to sleep at a reasonable time tonight. All of these things are identical to physical states. So in theory, we don't need to have these mental terms at all. We don't need to have terms about belief. We could completely replace them with physical terms if mind-brain identity theory is correct. One thing I want to point out is that mind-brain identity theory is materialist. This should probably be quite obvious, but let's just go through it. So the brain is a physical object. It obeys physical laws. If we're saying that every mental state type is identical to a physical state type, then we don't need for there to be anything non-physical in order to account for all mental terms. So there's no separate non-physical mind. There are no non-physical properties. This theory can be true, and still everything can be materialist. So mind-brain identity theory is consistent with materialism. And that's why a lot of people who want materialism to be true, who accept materialism based on the success of physical sciences, that's why they might be motivated to accept this theory, because it's very clearly consistent with materialism. But that by itself doesn't really give a reason to think the theory is true. That might give a reason why you might want it to be true, but is there any reason to think it is true? And mind-brain identity theorists have some arguments. First, they claim that this would just be another in a long line of identities discovered by science. So probably the best example is the discovery that water is H2O. Humans have known about water for a long time. Humans deal with water all the time. But humans, for most of history, didn't really know the inner nature of water. They knew that water was this stuff, humans drank it, but didn't understand what it was made of, what its essential composition was. But then eventually science came along and studied water and realized that what it is to be water is to be this particular chemical compound, H2O. And that being water and being H2O was exactly the same thing. So if we wanted to, we could get rid of all talk about water with just reference to this chemical compound, H2O, because they are exactly the same thing. And in fact, people often do use H2O to refer to water because they are the same thing. And so this is an identity that science has revealed to us. Similarly, this isn't as easy to say. H2O is a nice, simple thing that's easy to say. But lightning was discovered to be a specific kind of atmospheric electrical discharge. So this phrase, it probably needs to be more complicated to correctly identify lightning, but that's basically what lightning is. So again, humans encountered lightning all the time through all of human history, but humans didn't really understand the nature of lightning. Eventually, science studies lightning, reveals that lightning is atmospheric electrical discharge. So now there's this thing we were familiar with under the term lightning. We can replace talk about lightning with talk about atmospheric electrical discharge, because they are the same thing. And so this is another identity that science has revealed. Furthermore, sunlight. Sunlight comes down upon us every single day, and science has revealed that sunlight is photons emitted from a star by fusion. And so once again, you could replace talk about sunlight with talk about photons emitted from the sun by fusion. And the claim is that mental terms will eventually get the same treatment. Will eventually reveal the underlying physical nature of beliefs. For example, believing that snow is white, the way we've revealed the underlying physical nature of water or alcohol. So that's the claim. So the argument goes like this. Science in the past has often taken familiar terms and shown that what we refer to with those familiar terms is identical to some more complicated scientific concept. So that science reveals this underlying nature, and that's what we should be trying to do with mental terms. We're familiar with talking about beliefs. We deal with beliefs all the time. And what science should be doing is try to take that familiar term, like believing that snow is white, and revealing the more complicated physical nature. So that, to some extent, is an argument. But identity theorists can go further than this. So it's not just saying this has happened in the past, so we should hope for it to happen in the mental. They can actually point to some progress that's been made. For example, brain scans. Scientists have done a great deal of work experimenting on people's brains and measuring people's brains. So one thing scientists have done is have people in fMRI machines and then get those people to perform certain mental tasks and then measure the response of their brain. And it turns out that there are a lot of consistent patterns in the activations in people's brains when they're doing certain kinds of tasks. If it's a memory task, certain parts of the brain light up. If it's an arithmetic task, a different part. If it requires spatial reasoning, it's a different part. And this seems to suggest that there are physical parts of the brain that are associated with specific mental operations. So that might be some evidence that there is an identity between mental state types and physical state types. And that's why the same physical parts of the brain keep lighting up when people are doing the same mental operations. Next, there have been a lot of brain injury studies. One of the most famous is someone you might have heard of named Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage was a worker who got into an accident and a piece of metal was shoved through his brain. He survived this, but as a result of his injury, his entire personality radically changed. Before the accident, he was very conscientious and very nice. Afterward, he was lazy and listless and very irritable and basically a jerk. And so here we have a physical alteration, so physical damage to the brain, resulting in a mental change, a change in his personality. Once again, this suggests that there's a close relationship between the physical and the mental. And another example is implants. Cochlear implants are electrical devices that take vibrations from the air and translate them into electrical signals that are then sent to the nerves. And this allows people who are deaf, who have certain types of deafness, to hear. And so if this is possible, if it's possible to recreate the mental sensation of hearing with these physical implants, that suggests that not only is there a close connection between the mental and the physical, but that we have starting to get somewhat of a grasp on it. So these kinds of implants, and you can also think of the cybernetics. Some people have chips that are implanted in them, connected to their nervous system, and if they think about certain things, they can make the chip do things. I can't remember the specific things the chips can do. Maybe some of you know. Furthermore, identity theorists claim every day we're learning more about the brain, and every day brings the possibility for more identities between mental and physical. So in general, identity theorists point to science's history of revealing identities, and then point to successes with brain science that we've had so far, and suggests that this is going to continue until we have genuine identity theory. So we're at a point where we can replace mental terms with physical terms. And furthermore, one benefit of mind-brain identity theory is it's possible to test these claims. So if we want to test the claim that pain is identical to C fibers firing, what we would do is test correlations between pain and C fibers firing. And in fact, I told you at the beginning that this is out of date. And that's exactly why it's out of date, because it's possible to test this. And so that's a benefit of the theory. In addition to arguments for identity theory, there are arguments against dualism. One of the main arguments against dualism is that it's like vitalism. It's spooky, it is vague and makes no sense. The basic claim is that dualism gives up too soon, and it starts believing in stuff we don't need to believe in, that we don't yet have reason to believe in. So the idea is we want to be rational. We want to be scientists, basically. So we've made so much success dealing with the physical world by doing rigorous science about the physical world. If, when approaching the mental, we just say, well, it's a completely separate realm, it's completely different mental stuff, and that's what's going on, the claim is that that's just completely giving up, that we should try harder to figure out what is the physical thing that's going on when somebody believes something, when somebody wants something, when somebody is happy, when somebody is sad. So the reference to vitalism is an outdated theory of what it means to be alive. The thought was, what makes living matter different from non-living matter? Well, the difference is there's this substance. They called it things like élan vital, or I can't remember, life force. And that's the stuff that makes living things living and non-living things non-living. The point is, nobody believes in vitalism anymore because there's no reason to believe that there's this extra stuff. Because now we know a lot more about the processes that sustain life. So we don't need to believe that there's a vital substance that is in living things and in nothing else. Identity theorists say that that's exactly what dualism is. It's just saying, oh, there's this magic stuff, and this magic stuff makes the mental possible, whereas if you don't have this magic stuff, then there's no mental life. So that's how an identity theorist might put it. Obviously, the reference to magic is pretty dismissive, but just to give you an idea of what this argument is getting at. So the general argument for identity theory and against dualism relates to progress. The thought is studies have found connections between mental events and brain events. Brain states affect mental states. The best explanation is that mental states are brain states. So we can give kind of an argument to the best explanation here. So there are all those different ways in which physical states are related to mental states. So the brain injury studies, the brain scans, the implants, the ways you can manipulate the brain using physical means, and you can ask, what's the best explanation for that? And you might think the best explanation is that mental states are physical states, and that's why all this stuff is possible. And we don't need to say anything about dualism or separate mental substance. Which brings us to another concept, parsimony. So in inference to the best explanation, we're looking for the best explanation. And one thing that's often claimed to make an explanation better is if it's more parsimonious. Parsimony refers to theoretical simplicity. It means it requires fewer entities and fewer assumptions. Just to give you an example of parsimony at work, suppose you come into the room, John is there, and the last cookie is gone. So one explanation for this is that John ate the last cookie. But another explanation is that unobserved aliens used their mind control on John and made him take the last cookie and absorb it through his skin. So which of these is the most parsimonious? Well, clearly, the first one is the most parsimonious, because you already know that John exists, and you already know that John can eat things. So it doesn't require you to believe in that many things. It only requires you to believe in things that you know exist, and only in abilities that you know exist. Whereas on the other hand, the other explanation requires you to believe in unobserved aliens that you've never seen before. So you have to assume that these aliens exist. Then you have to believe that they have mind control powers, powers that you've never seen, that you don't know to exist yet. So you have to assume that this unobserved power exists. Next, you have to observe that John can absorb cookies through his skin. And presumably you've never seen John do that before. So now you have to have another assumption. All right, so that's why parsimony is thought to reveal which explanation is better. I'm guessing that when I told you this story and gave you these two explanations, you immediately thought the first explanation is much better. And now we can see that the first explanation is also much more parsimonious. And that in general turns out to be true. Usually if you think about which explanation is best, it turns out to be the one that's the most parsimonious. We can use this to give a parsimony explanation. So we know the brain exists, and we know that brain states and mental states are related to each other. So there's no reason to posit non-physical mental states, mental substances, which suggests that parsimony favors identity theory. Now, I just want to point out some problems for parsimony. First, is theoretical simplicity actually a sign of truth? Some people have claimed that it isn't, that there are other reasons to want simple theories, but just the fact that a theory is simple doesn't mean it's more likely to be true. And furthermore, parsimony, if you really want to describe it properly, it's not that a theory assumes fewer entities or has fewer assumptions. It's that it doesn't have unnecessary entities or unnecessary assumptions. And the question is, do we need to believe in dualism? Do we need to believe in non-physical minds in order to explain what actually happens? That's the question. A brief reply on the part of parsimony goes like this. Parsimony has worked well in the past. So Newton and Einstein's theories were accepted to a large extent because they were so elegant, so parsimonious, and they turned out to be wildly successful theories. And perhaps you could give a probability argument in favor of parsimony. Maybe something about being simple does mean you're more likely to be true. All right, so let's summarize where we are at this point. Identity theory says that mental states are brain states. Mental state types are identical to physical state types. You could replace all talk of the mental with talk of the physical with no loss. You could say exactly the same things without ever referring to beliefs or feelings. Identity theorists claim that science gives us reason to think this. But the question is, do we have enough evidence for this conclusion? As I suggested, we don't yet have these identity claims. The best example I gave you of one of the mind-brain identity claims was pain is identical to C fibers firing, and we already know that that one doesn't work. So there are problems for this. It raises a lot of questions, and in the next lecture, we'll see that there are other problems as well that perhaps other theories can solve. And we'll get to that next time.